Greetings, lovers of lore. Thank you for joining me for another installment of the Timestream Chronicles, and a special early hello to all of my patrons. Thank you very much for supporting my channel on Patreon. In the previous episode, we left off with Urza having been lured inside of Multani's trap, and he is now captured inside of the tree. So the story continues with Urza feeling lost. He has no concept of where he is or even who he is. The spirit of the forest, Multani, has infused him in the tree, keeping him static, unable to think properly. And while this is happening, the forest is actually feeding on him, dissolving him away. The tree was absorbing the mineral contents of his body. Now, Urza had no concept of how much time this was taking, but slowly and surely his fingers burned away. His mind was alight with pain. There was no escape from this, as one by one he lost his fingers. And once his fingers were gone, that was no escape as well, as Multani just turned to absorbing Urza's toes and the rest of his body bit by bit within the tree. And Multani is gaining a great amount of joy from Urza's suffering. He is extracting as much punishment for Argoth's destruction as he possibly can. Multani spoke into Urza's pain-racked mind. When your son Harbin landed on Argoth, the island itself guided him to a green limb. He had destroyed his ornithopter, and all he needed was one solid spar to be back on his way. And Titania, in her infinite mercy, showed him a perfect fallen limb from the forest that he could use. And in return, Harbin went back home to you, and you came back. You sent him back with armies to ravage the Argothian forest. Glorious ancient trees gone forever, felled by your heartless machines. Hundreds upon hundreds of druids lost their lives. Wild beasts were hunted to extinction. There are species of animal that existed on Dominaria that no longer exist because of your actions. Argoth was pillaged, burned, and destroyed, all in the name of two arrogant brothers. Like worms in an apple, you ate away at the heart of Titania until she could take no more and collapsed under the burden. At this point, Urza could actually feel what was going on. He was Titania. His body was racked with pain. He felt with anguished clarity his own armies, the armies that he had unleashed on the Isle of Argoth, these tiny creatures that swarmed the full breadth of his body. He could feel every inch of Argoth within him. And as these creatures swarmed over him, they pulled him apart the same way that the tree had dissolved him. They reduced him to mere resources to continue the conflict endlessly. Urza felt a wordless scream rack his body, but he couldn't bring himself to planeswalk away from what was going on, because at this point, to him, the forest was his body. He had no ability to leave his body, so he stayed and endured. So from this point, the story actually jumps ahead a full 2 years, at which point the Forbidden Zone of the Mana Rig is fully operational. The goblin tribes, all three different tribes, have been united under the Tristau chieftain. His name is Glostongue Crackcrest. Now, unfortunately for him, and actually for Teferi and Joyra as well, there was a particular goblin that was not a specific chieftain, but had a high level of charisma for a goblin. His name was Machinist Turd, and he had a knack for flattery and finagling what he wanted from other goblins. So through a cunning campaign of speeches and glad handling and other underhanded measures, he had actually become essentially the promised one amongst goblins. And as a result, even though the Tristau chieftain was in charge of the goblins, he had to get final approval for all of his decisions through Machinist Turd. The other goblins looked upon him with that much favor. And part of that was because Machinist Turd was actually a rarity amongst goblins. Not only did he have all of his teeth, which was incredibly rare for a goblin. His teeth were dazzlingly white, which was virtually unheard of for a goblin, and amongst goblin kind was actually considered a sign that you were chosen by the gods. So it was currently Teferi's unfortunate duty to be dealing with Machinist Turd. It was the only way to make progress on the projects that they were currently undertaking. Now, Turd may have been well liked amongst the goblins, but to Teferi, he was massively obnoxious, mainly because of his inability to actually go ahead and transmit information in a useful way. He used very vague terms that required that Teferi would play essentially a guessing game with him. So at this point, Machinist Turd has told Teferi, the rock thingies are ready. And Teferi goes, okay, what do you mean? Do you mean the ore conveyors? At which point Turd just starts shaking his head rapidly. Nope, okay, on to the next thing then. Is it the crystal presses? And at this point, Turd stops and thinks for a moment, and then again shakes his head, and Teferi sighs. Oh, is it the Thran metal molds? And at this point, Turd starts hopping around excited. Yes, yes, he's tapping on his nose. You make Turd pretty rock now? Basically, the deal that they had made with the goblins was that once a month, all of the goblins would be given small Power Stone crystals. In truth, these were actually just cast-off shards from the creation of regular Power Stones, but the goblins didn't know any difference. And on top of that, these shards and Power Stones, none of them were actually charged. To properly charge these devices would take a whole bunch of mana permanently out of large swaths of land for a regular-sized Power Stone, and for the giant Power Stone that they were building for Urza's flying machine, that would actually require completely depleting an entire world of all of its mana just to get that stone going. So there was no real danger from giving the goblins these Power Stones, and it made them happy. Turd, for example, right now, was happily cackling about how he was going to use his magic stone to become a big magic man and a big shot over all the other goblins to become the big, bad Goblin King. And after going on about that, he hurried off to tell the other goblin scum to work faster, in his words. Now, as Turd headed off, he was replaced by a far more capable individual, and that was Diago the Viashino. He had actually proven quite useful in a number of ways. He worked as a great go-between. He had helped between him and the Bay. They had stopped the Viashino from revolting. Urza had been gone for 2 full years at this point, and they were finding it quite difficult to stop the Viashino from just completely wiping out their ancestral enemies, the goblins. But at this point, between the efforts of Diago the Bay and Joyra promising that Urza would be back very soon, they had managed to barely maintain order in the mana ring. Now, Diago was here to report to Karn. Karn was the manager of the Thran Forge. So Diago reported that they had finally finished the castings that Urza had requested for his flying machine, and Diago was requesting that Karn come down and give visual approval to the project. And Karn said he would accompany Diago after he had waited for the reports from the lava batteries. Upon hearing this, Diago paused. You could tell that there was something that was making him uncomfortable, and it took him a moment to finally speak up and say, by completing these castings, this means our bargain is complete, and we are ready to claim our payment in the form of Karn coming with us. Karn went to speak, but was interrupted when Joyra jumped in and said, actually, the terms of the deal were that we would have a completely functional Thran Metal Man prototype. Now, Diago objected to this. He said, you've abandoned those plans. You have not done any work on them in however many years at this point. Joyra says, no, actually, we do have plans specifically for these metal men. We have brand new plans that take into account the metal's growth. Now, Diago, being skeptical, said, I'd like to see these plans. But Joyra deferred him by saying, tomorrow I will show you the plans, and tomorrow we will begin casting this metal man. Diago's eyes hardened. Once these are cast, at which point Joyra again interrupts, not waiting for him to finish. Then our deal is complete, and you may take possession of Karn. Diago accepted this response with a bow and left, at which point the three friends, Teferi, Joyra, and Karn, they all exchanged worried glances, Teferi looking pointedly over at Joyra and saying, "You don't really have any new plans, do you?" To which Joyra responded, "No, I don't actually have any new plans, but what I do have is old plans for Talarian runners. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify them tonight using Urza's nesting doll pattern, and ideally what will happen is this will hold them off at least for a while we wait for Urza, and it might actually even work out in our favor because the designs might work out as another tool that we can use against Phyrexia." After what she said had had a few moments to hang in the air, she spoke aloud what all three were thinking. "I hope Urza returns soon." All the way over in the forest of Yavimaya, Urza was still trapped inside the tree. In fact, he had been there for so long, he could remember no real aspect of himself whatsoever. He had been slowly dissolved to the point where he was now completely one with the gigantic Magnagoth tree. And he drifted mindlessly through the tree when he wasn't directly being pulled back into the nightmare of Argoth. There were a few moments he was able to escape it, but then he would be pulled right back in, and he would feel the tiny men swarming his body, their axes biting into his limbs over and over. He was being despoiled time and again. Urza and Mishra had landed upon Argoth. They were plague and famine, fire and flood. Anything standing between them was destroyed by their hatred. He watched as ancient trees were felled, their corpses dragged away to be hacked apart into more parts to build more monstrous devices of destruction. He felt the flames, and he smelled the dark billowing smoke. The sky darkened over Argoth. What drove these awful brothers? The question didn't originate from Urza's mind. It was alien, forced into his mind from another. He understood the motivations of these people. They had the highest intentions and hopes, but that was tainted by fear, and that's what leads to situations like this. As he thought this, around him, the wood pulsed with anger, just tearing into his thoughts, rendering them into tiny little motes and scattering them on the breeze. Urza and Mishra were monsters, pure corruption, motivated only by desire to despoil. Urza's mind recoiled and pushed back against what was going on. In some dim corner, he knew that he was not the Isle of Argoth, but there was an isle that was important to him, Talaria. And as that part of his mind started to think about Talaria, all the visions that he was seeing started to morph. The trees that were on fire, they turned into people, white-robed students. Instead of axe machines and other devices like that, there were artifact creatures, specifically the Talarian runners, the pumas, the scorpions. The armies that they were facing off against weren't the Argivians and the Philagi, but instead they were Phyrexian beasts, negators, and fiends. When Urza looked upon the Phyrexians, he realized that everything that had been going on Argoth with Urza and Mishra in comparison was insignificant. There was no way to reasonably compare the two. Urza's thoughts were interrupted as his mind erupted with pain, and the wood encroached closer upon him, pulling him back down into the darkness and drawing his thoughts apart so that he could not resist. On the Isle of Talaria, the situation was dire. Baron stood atop the highest tower in the Talarian Academy. Phyrexians had completely overrun the school. At this point, they had nothing left they could do aside from their last resort, which was to summon Urza back from wherever he has been for the last number of years to assist him. So Baron pulled out the dagger that he had that was linked to a special pendant around Urza's neck that was meant to summon him at a moment's notice, and he activated the beacon. All right, my friends, that ends this installment of the Timestream Chronicles. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you like what I'm doing here, consider hopping on my Patreon. It's the absolute best way to support the channel so I can continue to make these awesome lore videos. Again, thanks for being here. I will see you all soon. And remember, my friends, lore is life.